for those that don't know, here is our early career researcher, Keynote. Amy Peacock is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Tasmania. She completed her PhD last year on alcohol and energy drinks and is the recipient of this year's APSAD Early Career Researcher Award. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you for the introduction. So to start off with, I'd like to thank APSAD for inviting me here to talk today. And more specifically, I'd like to thank APSAD for their support of early career researchers. We had a fantastic ECR event last night that was very well attended, and it's quite nice to see some new smiling faces in the crowd. So thanks to the rest of the ECR committee and to everyone who attended that event. So, as mentioned today, I'm going to be talking to you about one of my main research interests, and that's energy drinks, particularly the mixture of energy drinks with alcohol. To give you a brief background about myself, so I first started to look at energy drinks when I did my honours in 2008, and then continued on when I did my PhD from 2011 till last year, and as part of my postdoctoral research since then. I have to admit that I am somewhat surprised that I'm standing here in front of you today. All through my schooling, my undergraduate, I thought that I would end up being a secondary school English teacher, and I think that potentially I've chosen the less traumatic option here. So just to start off with, I want to point out my conflicts of interest. So I have received placebo samples from an energy drink company. This was for a study in 2011. I can confirm that this organisation had no role in the design, analysis and reporting, and also no financial support was provided, and that relationship ended at the end of that study. So, to what captured my interest back in 2008 when I was doing my honours. For those who don't know, energy drinks, we define them as products that are marketed as improving your performance and enhancing your alertness. These beverages first came onto the market in the US in the 1980s, and it took about 10 years for them to get to Australia. And we saw a huge increase in their popularity when they did arrive, particularly amongst the younger demographic. And a recent study by Amy Panay did actually show that we see around 2/5 of young people reporting use in the last 3 months. Now, while these products might not give you wings, research definitely does suggest that they will enhance your performance. So you generally have a better reaction time, you're feeling a bit more alert, a bit more awake when you have them on board. So, given their popularity, it wasn't really surprising that we saw a huge increase in the number of brands that are available. But what is interesting is that these products generally have quite a similar ingredient profile. So we generally see them containing caffeine, taurine, glucuronolactone, sugar and B vitamins. In Australia, unlike many other countries, we actually have regulations regarding the caffeine content of energy drinks. So we can't actually, these beverages can't contain more than 80 milligrams per 250 mils. So in fact, that's equivalent to a cup of instant coffee. I have, though, put up here for reference the final one, the 5-Hour Energy. This is a product that's sold in America where they don't regulate the caffeine content. And this product, sold in a shot package, which isn't allowed in Australia, has the equivalent to a very, very, very strong cup of coffee. And if you were to have the equivalent of a 250 ml beverage, you're looking at, 4 very strong coffees. Unlike many other countries, Australia also has guidelines in regards to recommended maximum intake. So we don't recommend that people consume more than 2 250 ml beverages a day. So it really is the caffeine content of the beverage that is of concern to us. And when we look at those countries where the caffeine content isn't regulated, we do see an increase in adverse exposures. So what I've got presented here is some data from US emergency departments, and you can see that, that definite increase in number of presentations. Unfortunately, in Australia, we don't code energy drink involvement in exposures very well. So we don't have very good data, but you can see, so from the New South Wales Poison Information Call Centre, we have also had an increase in number of exposures from energy drinks, although on a much smaller scale. So there are a number of situations in which people generally report these adverse exposures. The first being when they've engaged in excess consumption. The challenge around defining excess consumption is that it very much varies from individual to individual, depending on how tolerant they are to the effects of caffeine. Other situations are when we see them combining them with other substances, primarily illicit stimulants and alcohol. Use by people who aren't tolerant to the effects of caffeine. So reflecting on the previous slide, a lot of those emergency department visits and New South Wales poison information calls were related to paediatric exposures. And finally, we see presentations when people have a pre-existing medical condition that's exacerbated by use, particularly cardiovascular conditions. The reason why we think it's the caffeine that is the problem is because the symptom profile very closely mimics what you see when someone is experiencing caffeine intoxication. So the common things that people were reporting, agitation, headaches, muscle twitching, difficulty sleeping, they're very common in those sort of situations. Another aspect of energy drinks that probably has caused us a little bit of concern also is the marketing strategies employed. Some of the tasteful ones are displayed here. So generally they're marketed alongside high-risk extreme sports, and some people have argued that this allows consumers to vicariously participate in the risk-taking and also encourages excess consumption. And while some people might try and refute that argument, it's a bit hard to argue against the fact that they're aligning, or some brands align themselves with risky behaviours. So around the mid-2000s, we started to become aware of this consumption trend where people were mixing alcohol and energy drinks together. And it really generated a lot of concern, not only because of the harms associated with alcohol, but because of these adverse exposures with energy drinks and that risk-taking association with the beverages. So for those people who haven't had the pleasure of having a Jaeger bomb before, I will just give you a quick definition. So it's all having alcohol mixed with energy drink, or refer to it as AmED, is all about having overlapping effects. So you might be mixing the beverages in the same glass and consuming it. You might be having, sorry, I keep saying you might be having a shot of spirits followed by an energy drink chaser, or it might be that the person has an energy drink at some point in their drinking session to pep them up. The main way that we see people mixing the two, though, is what is on the screen here, and I just referred to a Jaeger bomb. With these bomb drinks, the person drops a shot of spirits into a glass of energy drinks and then sculls it quite quickly, generally half of it in their mouth, half everywhere else around them as well. Very classy. And just to reiterate how classy mixing alcohol and energy drinks can be, I tried to find some videos for you, but none of them were quite appropriate to put up here. But it's generally, because of these bomb drinks, it's generally associated with excess consumption by young people, very eloquently captured here by Mamma Mia, what we drink when we're 21 versus 29. So when we had a number of cases of people reporting death or near-death experiences from excess consumption, or the behaviours that they'd engage in excess consumption, there was a lot of concern. And we did see quite a number of professional bodies calling for further regulation, if not ban, of these two beverages mixed together. The problem was that it was such a new consumption trend that we hadn't really conducted any research. So at that point of time, around 2010, 2011, the only paper published by Australian researchers was by AmED and colleagues, and she'd done a fantastic job of trying to summarise the potential harms of mixing these two together based on our knowledge of the two separate. But we hadn't actually looked at the combination of the two. And this was reflected internationally as well. Just a handful of studies, university student samples, how many people are mixing. So at that point in time, we had some really big questions to answer. We didn't know how many people were mixing, how they were mixing, where they were consuming the beverages mixed together. We didn't know what was driving their beverage choice, and most importantly of all, we didn't know about the consequences of use. So did having AmED substantially increase alcohol-related harms? So I started my PhD on this topic in 2011 with some of these questions in mind. And over the last couple of years, I've been lucky enough to work with some fantastic researchers. My supervisor, Raimondo Bruno at UTAS, also Peter Miller and Nick Drost at Deakin University, and Amy Finney and Dan Lubman at La Trobe University and Turning Point, respectively. So I want to talk about some of the research that we've conducted in the last few years. I also want to put it in the context of other Australian research and the international research, just because there has been so much done in the last few years, and because there have been quite a number of people who've stepped up and worked in this space in the last few years in Australia. So we've had Gina Trapp in Western Australia, Sandra Jones, Simone Pettigrew, Rebecca McKeaton, Sarah Benson, Andrew Sholly. There are quite a number of people working in this space, so I want to make sure that I acknowledge their work as well. So I'm going to try and attempt to answer these questions. I'd just like to point out for any PhD students in the audience, this looks like a nice logical research plan or research questions. I prettied it up for you here, but when I started out, it was definitely not this neat and tidy. So don't think I was this organised to start with. So the consumption patterns. As I mentioned, we luckily had a study conducted by Amy Panay, published this year, and it showed us that around 5% of the Australian population report mixing these two in the last 3 months. When we look at people aged 18 to 24, though, the rates of use are considerably higher, so around 1 in 5 reporting use in the last 3 months. And this is reflected when we look at university student samples. So that's a group generally characterised by heavier drinking. And we can see that, between 15 and 48% of university students report mixing in the last month. Another group who's often characterised by heavy alcohol use are regular illicit stimulant users. And again, we see high rates of use amongst these samples as well. Looking at the actual consumption patterns, so I presented here the results of 3 studies that we've conducted, looking at the frequency of use of AmED amongst consumers, and overwhelmingly you can see that it is an infrequent practice. So they're using it on a monthly or less basis. And what's probably most important to note about this is that they're using alcohol without energy drinks more frequently on the most part. So it's an occasional practice for these people. In regards to their alcohol intake, we haven't really got a clear picture. So from 2 studies presented here, you can see in the grey there was a small magnitude, it was significant, but small magnitude increase in alcohol intake for one study, but a small magnitude decrease for the other one. And this contradictory finding has really been reflected internationally as well. What I probably really want to point out though is that people perceive AmED use as a heavier consumption trend. So they generally report that they're going to be having their Jaeger bomb when they're planning to have a big night out. Very few people or very few researchers have assessed energy drink intake in AmED sessions, and from what we found with our research is that people report having more energy drinks when they're mixing with alcohol versus when they're having energy drinks by themselves. And what's probably most notable about this graph is that people are having 3 energy drinks on average when they're mixing with alcohol, which is in excess of our guidelines. When we've drilled down into this a bit further, we came across the somewhat surprising finding that people who knew the guidelines were more likely to exceed the guidelines. It's logical, isn't it? Indeed, so probably the strongest predictors of exceeding the guidelines were their frequency of use and whether they were exceeding the alcohol intake guidelines as well. But it really does tell us that knowing about the guidelines doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be complying with them. In regards to settings for use, people are generally starting to drink these beverages late at night, with around 1 in 10 starting after midnight. And they're predominantly using them in licensed venues and in private parties. So with alcohol, we see a greater range of context, you know, with a meal, at home with friends and family. Somewhat surprisingly, we didn't see people reporting Jaeger bombs at home with the family at dinner. Surprising. Jaeger trains are very popular though. So to summarise this area of research, it's only a small proportion of the population who report mixing, but that proportion is much higher when you look at those samples who report heavy alcohol use. They might only be using AmED infrequently, but they're consuming energy drinks in excess and potentially consuming alcohol in excess. And just because they know about the guidelines doesn't mean they're going to stick with them. What was probably most interesting is that we know they're consuming them late at night in very certain settings, and this kind of led us to think about the motivations for use, what's driving their beverage choice in these settings. So the motivations for use still remains relatively under-researched, I think, but there have been a few studies conducted, and across these studies there's general agreement into the main types of motivations for mixing. The first type of motivation we call is the hedonistic motivation. So they're sensational pleasure seeking. They like the taste, or slightly more concerningly, they want to increase that intensity or pleasure of intoxication. The second type of motive is social, so it's their peers, their environment in which they're consuming, sharing a round of drinks, celebrating a special occasion. The third type, energy endurance motives. So this is when they want to stay awake for longer. This is when they want to feel more alert. And the final type is intoxication reduction. So they want to try and control their intoxication, try and reduce it in some way. So we found that consumers can be distinguished in regards to their types of motivations. So the first type of consumer we call taste preference consumers, and that's around 1/3 of them, and that's in the green line there. So they've got a moderate probability of saying, hey, I really like the taste of these drinks, that's the main reason why I'm having them. The second type of group we call energy-seeking consumers. They like the taste, but they want to stay out for a bit longer, they want to not feel as tired when they're out. The third type of consumer we call hedonistic consumers. They like the taste, they like the energy effect, but they also think that they like the buzz, they want to increase intoxication, intensity and the pleasure of it. And the final group in red seem to be doing it for every single reason under the sun, including the fact that they think they can try and control their intoxication in some way. So as part of his PhD work, Nick Drost at Deakin University has been doing some great research around looking at the association between motivations for use and harms that people are experiencing. And what he's managed to show is that those people who endorse those hedonistic motives, that wanting to increase the intensity of pleasure and intoxication, they're drinking more heavily, they're having more energy drinks, they're more likely to experience aggression, and they're more likely to experience harm as well in general. And those intoxication reduction motives as well, trying to control your intoxication, are also somewhat strangely, also associated with harms. So we know the majority of people are doing it because they like the taste, they want to stay awake for a bit longer, but there are that proportion of consumers who are doing it because they want to alter their intoxication in some way. They think they can enhance it or that they can control it and reduce it. The fact that people who endorsed hedonistic motives are more likely to experience harms tells us something about those consumers, that maybe they are a more risky type of person in general. But what I think is probably most interesting about the motives is that so many people are consuming these beverages mixed together on the assumption that they will have an interactive effect and change their intoxication in some way. So, moving on to the consequences. When these concerns around alcohol and energy drinks first started to appear, a number of researchers tried to propose some hypotheses about how the two might interact together based on our knowledge of the global pharmacological effects of the separate drinks. What they first proposed was that there'd be some change to the experience, the nature of intoxication. So the stimulant effects of the energy drink would mask the depressant effects of the alcohol in some way. The critical component to that is that those depressant cues, the fatigue, the stumbling, the loss of motor coordination, they tell people it's time to go home now. You've had too much to drink. So with a reduction in those cues, it's thought that people have a misperception of intoxication. So that is, they think they're less drunk than they would be if they had alcohol without energy drink. And because of that misperception, they have impaired decision making, and then they're more likely to drink more, stay out later, and engage in risky behaviours. So I'm just going to work through each of these three separately. So firstly, nature of intoxication. The best way that we can tell the relative harms of these drinks is to take the one person and see what happens when they have alcohol and energy drinks versus alcohol alone. And there have been 3 survey studies conducted where we've got people to retrospectively self-report their outcomes when they've had alcohol and energy drinks versus alcohol. Generally, across these studies, we've seen support for that idea of increased stimulation. So when people are mixing, they've got greater odds of tremors, irregular and rapid heartbeat, increased speech speed, inability to sleep, agitation, and jolt and crash episodes. So a big surge in energy followed by a really quick drop. Probably more concerningly, participants reported reduced odds of sedation side effects. So they were less likely to say that they were experiencing nausea, alterations in vision and walking, and less likely to have slurred speech. So they're the things that tell you how drunk you are. There have been a few more lab studies conducted where people have been brought in and administered alcohol and energy drinks versus alcohol alone to try and get at the effects of the beverage itself. And while findings are a little bit mixed, there are some suggestions that mixing the two does increase people's ratings of stimulation, although ratings of sedation sort of seem to stay the same. However, these studies have involved administration of one energy drink. And as you remember from before, people aren't having one energy drink when they go out at night. They're generally having 3 or more energy drinks. So we found that we needed to try and work to extend into these higher doses to increase our generalisability. Secondly, at that point in time, we were only testing on the ascending limb. And we know that on the ascending limb, at one point, a person might be experiencing stimulation side effects, and at the same point on the descending limb, experiencing sedation effects. So it's critical to be testing across the curve. So I've got presented here some data from our honours students this year. This is unpublished at the moment. They had to get participants into the lab on 4 occasions. And what we did is in every condition we gave them alcohol. In one condition they had just alcohol. Another one, they had alcohol with the sugar content of 3 energy drinks. Another one, alcohol with the caffeine content of 3 energy drinks. And then the final condition, although counterbalanced, was alcohol with the full 3 energy drinks. They had the delightful concoction of these beverages being masked with English toffee and black cherry syrup. Not recommended, but definitely makes them think that they're drinking energy drinks. So a successful placebo for us. What probably is most interesting from these findings, so we got them to rate their stimulation over the course of intoxication, and from 120 to 185 minutes, we found greater ratings of stimulation when people had alcohol and energy drinks versus alcohol alone, supporting that idea that at higher levels of energy drink intake, people are getting those stimulation effects. So generally, we're seeing some support for this idea of a change in nature of intoxication. And it does seem to suggest that it's the whole energy drink beverage driving this effect. So we didn't see significant differences in that previous slide between alcohol alone versus alcohol with just the sugar or just the caffeine. So it's the combination that's driving it. Where I think we need to go next is to try and work out what's the threshold for those adverse side effects. Clearly, people aren't sticking with the guidelines, so they must potentially be feeling like they're tolerant to the effects or that they can handle the effects of 2 energy drinks. So what's the threshold at which we start to see those adverse effects? So generally support for this idea. Looking now at the intensity of intoxication, so what's your perception of your level of intoxication? This whole idea was based on some early research by Ferrer and colleagues, and they found that when they got people into the lab and gave them alcohol and energy drinks versus alcohol alone, they had lower headache ratings, lower ratings of dry mouth, lower ratings of alterations in motor coordination. And from this one study, it was concluded that energy drinks mixed with alcohol change your ratings of intoxication and make you misperceive. From that point onward, we have tried to more directly measure their intensity of intoxication. So in our lab, we get them to rate on a 100-point scale how intoxicated they feel. Other labs get them to tell how many beers they think they've consumed as an indicator of intoxication. So there was a systematic review of these studies conducted in 2014 by Sarah Benson. So these studies, this analysis, this looked at studies which had combined alcohol and caffeine or alcohol and energy drinks compared to alcohol alone, and it showed no significant difference between the intoxication ratings. What we do need to take into consideration though is that 4 of these studies involve the administration of energy drinks. So we do need to focus on the whole beverage because there are a number of extra ingredients in energy drinks which might have an impact. So we do need to take that into account. And these studies, these 4 studies, only gave 1 energy drink. Again, going back to that idea of what are people having in the real world. So there was definitely scope to explore further. So our honours students also got people to rate their level of intoxication in that same study I referred to earlier. And we found lower ratings of intoxication when people had alcohol and energy drinks together versus alcohol alone when we gave them 3 energy drinks. So it does support that idea that alcohol and energy drinks will reduce intoxication. But what was more interesting was that we found lower intoxication ratings when people had alcohol and sugar together versus alcohol alone as well. So what this seemed to tell us is maybe it's not the whole energy drink that's driving this effect, maybe it's the sugar content, the high sugar content of the mixer that's driving this effect. So overall, it tells us that if you're having 1 energy drink with alcohol, that people are probably not going to be reporting that misperception or that underestimation of intoxication. But if it's at that higher level, as similar to what people are consuming in the real world, you're likely to see that effect potentially based on this early study. what we do need to explore further though is this effect unique to energy drinks? Is it that you would see a similar effect if you gave someone Coke, for example, with that level of sugar, or another type, or a fruit juice, or something with a similar high level of sugar in it? So early support, but we do need to explore further. So the final element, risk-taking behaviour. So my PhD was really focused on risk-taking behaviour, and I can't tell you the number of anecdotes I've had about people's experiences when they've had alcohol and energy drinks. Never tell anyone that you do research on alcohol and energy drinks, because the horror stories are... they are horror stories. So we really expected people to be saying, yes, I'm engaging in more risk behaviours. So this was the first publication from my PhD, and that's one of the studies here. And as you can see, across the board, across these 3 studies, there's been lower odds of risk-taking behaviour after mixing alcohol and energy drinks versus alcohol alone. I'd always recommend to a PhD student, try not to find anything too controversial for your first study. It can be a little difficult to explain. But what we need to think about with these studies is they don't take into account the frequency of use. So people are using AmED a lot less frequently, so they've got fewer opportunities to engage in risk-taking. The other thing is that we're treating AmED consumers as one big group. So when we've tried to characterise the different types of consumers, we can see that there's 3 main types. The first type of consumer we've called low risk-taking consumers, because they didn't really engage in any of the risk behaviours that we assessed. The second type, and that's around half of the consumers that we surveyed in this study, we called disinhibited intake consumers. So they had AmED, they spent a little bit too much, they drank a little bit too much, but that was about the sum of it. The final group, so about 14% of consumers, we called high risk-taking consumers. And again, this was because they had a moderate to high probability of engaging in every risk behaviour that we assessed after AmED. What was interesting to us is that when we plotted these 3 groups in regards to their risk-taking behaviour after alcohol, the pattern of results was very, very similar, which seemed to suggest to us that maybe these people who are engaging in these risk behaviours after mixing are also doing it when they have alcohol alone. And it's something about the individual as well. So when we've looked at the correlates of engaging in the risk behaviour after AmED use, the strongest correlate of that was engaging in the risk behaviour when they have alcohol. So if you're going to be engaging in that behaviour when you have alcohol, you're also highly likely to be doing it when you have AmED. So again, supporting that idea that it's something about the consumer. What is interesting, that in the final model, energy drink intake for a number of behaviours was still associated with engaging in that risk-taking behaviour in AmED sessions. So while we can't infer causation, it does suggest that there is a relationship there between that energy drink intake. And this is supported by our experimental research. So this is the only study conducted to date in a lab where we've objectively measured risk-taking. We got participants to come in, we gave them placebo, 1 energy drink, alcohol, and 1 energy drink and alcohol together. And they had the fun task of pumping up a simulated balloon. For every pump of that balloon, they earned money, but if they pumped it beyond a predetermined explosion point, they lost all their money. So more pumps of the balloon was equivalent to greater risk-taking. And from this, we found a main effect of energy drink. And what that meant was that people were more risky when they had energy drink on board, regardless of whether alcohol was there, versus when they didn't. A small magnitude effect. We definitely need to look into higher doses, but there was something there. So that body of literature at the moment is telling us that a small proportion of AmED consumers are engaging in high-risk behaviours. But there's something about the characteristics of people who are attracted to AmED use, because if they're engaging in the risk behaviour after AmED, they're also probably engaging in it after alcohol. The fact, though, that energy drink intake was still associated with the risk behaviour, and that we did see that effect in the lab of increased risk-taking after energy drink, means, though, that we can't conclusively rule out the role of the energy drink in increasing risk behaviour. And from working in this area, I'm increasingly becoming sure that there's some interaction between the characteristics of those people attracted to the energy drink mixed with alcohol and also the effects of the beverage together. So still some work to go before we can be conclusive in regards to this. So where to from here? From my thinking, we've spent a lot of time now conducting retrospective surveys, getting people to report on what they did when they were highly intoxicated over the last 6 months. We've also spent some time getting people into the lab in an artificial environment, trying to control all other aspects that might influence their intoxication experience. So I think it's now time for us probably to step out into the pubs and clubs and start to see what's really happening for people in the real world. I think we also need to do some more work to see whether we need to focus on energy drinks specifically or whether we need to look at mixers more broadly, because if it is the high sugar content which is driving some of these effects, we do need to explore this, I think. And also, again, to reiterate that idea of knowing what's the threshold at which people generally start to experience those adverse stimulation-based side effects, to provide information to consumers. So last year we had our very first International Energy Drinks Conference. This was conducted at Deakin University, and together a number of researchers, policymakers, health professionals, youth workers and so on, all came together and drafted a statement of concern, highlighting potential policy options, but more importantly where research needs to go in future in this area. And also welcoming anyone else who's interested in conducting research in this area. Some of the points that were raised as part of this statement highlighted potential policy options in future, and particularly related to the energy drinks, so making changes to the availability, the marketing, and so on. But I think this is important to take into consideration. But again, I think that we need to think more as well about the individual, because if we just target the beverage, it's not going to be helping those people who are at high risk of adverse outcomes. So some combination of the two in future is probably warranted. So to summarise the last 5 years in one slide. So we know now that the people who mix alcohol and energy drinks, they're having them late at night in high-risk settings, and they're not sticking with the guidelines in general, even if they know them. We know that a number of consumers, they're using them because they think they can change their intoxication in some way. They think they can enhance it, they think they can decrease it. The evidence seems to suggest that yes, it does change your nature of intoxication, your experience. You are more stimulated. Whether you are thinking that you are less drunk is still yet to be determined, although, again, as mentioned, maybe it's that sugar that's driving that effect. And what I think, again, most important, this consumer group, they are a high-risk subgroup of alcohol consumers, and if we're going to be thinking about this in future, we need to take into consideration the individual, the setting in which they consume the drink, and the pharmacological effects of the drink as well. So, just to thank my primary collaborators again, and thank you all for listening.